Welcome to the Sportsman's Voice podcast, your inside connection to outdoor legislation. From the Beltway to policy happening your way, we're covering it all. I'm your host, Fred Bird. Join us as we explore public land access, wildlife and fisheries management, Second Amendment rights, the triumphs that shape our nation, the sports we all love, and the stories that fuel our passion for the great outdoors. This is the Sportsman's Voice podcast. Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, to this feature edition of the Sportsman's Voice podcast. This week, we're talking predators, predator management. It's a hot button topic, gets a lot of attention. Um, I would say geographically, but not so much anymore. We're kind of all across the country between trapping, large predators that are socially, aesthetically pleasing. People want to see things like grizzly bears, lions, wolves, things like that. And then down to, trapping and meso predators and nest raiding on ground laying birds. And heck, we're even gonna get into a conversation about oceanic predators towards the end of this conversation. But all that and so very much more. I'm joined by our assistant manager, Marie Newmiller, in the West, Northwest, and assistant manager in the Southeast, Mark Lance. Big doings in both regions of the country. Obviously, you guys hear from me almost on a weekly basis of something going on here in the Northeast. Um, Southwest, we cover it with some things happening down there, some species moving from the south into the lower 48. So again, all that and so much more. We welcome in Marie and Mark to touch on predator management. Let's go. Marie, you have a spring bear season out by you, right?
Oregon and Idaho do. Washington does not anymore.
Okay. You ever get over there to do that?
I haven't yet. It'd be fun though. I was just a few points away from drawing in Washington because it averaged about 4, and I think I was at 3, and then they canceled the season.
Oh, it's a draw
The
in
Washington
Washington.
one was, yeah.
Okay. Got it. Is it over the counter in those other two states?
I'm not sure about Oregon. I'd have to double check, but Idaho is.
That's awesome. We do not have it in the East. On Indian land, you can do that. They do a spring bear hunt, but there is, culturally no appetite for it over here.
Oh,
You get a lot of pushback. And Mark doesn't have a spring bear either. They can barely get a fall bear, but we're gonna talk about all that here and, might as well kick off the show. We have Marie Newmiller, Mark Lance, both, talented folks here for the Congressional Sportsmen's Foundation. Marie in the Northwest, Mark in the Southeast, holding it down. And we're gonna we're gonna have a conversation about predator management, things we have going on, legislation that we've been working on really hard since last year. This whole 2025 session. And just kind of a bigger, broader topic, thinking about who our audience is here. Ideally, we have legislators that are tuning in, folks on the Hill that are tuning in and really using this as a resource and trying to understand. And, you know, conversations like this, you both know, just really get out of hand quick with a lot of emotion. Um, I like to think that people can come to this podcast, listen, and be very rational, um, and removing a lot of that hyperbole out of there. So, um, I want to start in the South because I think that's really interesting. Mark, you last year, big victory in Louisiana, bringing back right after a number of years of black bear season in Louisiana, and then we're on the precipice of doing the same thing in Florida. Uh, Talk to us about Louisiana, the success that was there, and what's on in store for Florida.
Yeah, thanks, Fred. Appreciate you having me on. And yeah, I think we talked about it with the former Secretary Madison Sheehan, the Louisiana Department of Wildlife and Fisheries, back in November of last year during the NASC summit. But yeah, Louisiana was a big win. It was the first black bear season down there since the late 1980s. It was certainly a process to get to that point. Um, and with that proposal that went through, there were 11 tags that were issued, and all but one tag was filled. Every hunter had 100% opportunity rate, so it wasn't a matter of that one hunter not seeing bears that were available to be taken. Um, so all in all, it was a very successful season down there. It was something that we were obviously very involved in, with the commission and the department and so many other in-state and national partners. It raised a lot of money that's going back into black bear conservation there in Louisiana. So all in all, it was a very successful season, and we're seeing that they might expand that season here in 2025 and issue. I think they're going up to 26 tags, up from 11 from last year. So all good things in Louisiana, and yeah, to your point, Florida is actually in the process of considering bringing back their black bear season, which would be the first one since 2014 or 2015. Had a big win at the commission meeting back in May, where the FWC approved that initial framework. We're looking at a possible 187 tags over 4 different bear hunting zones. So that'll be brought back for a final vote in August, and hopefully we'll see that go through favorably.
Do you know can you tell us geographically both states where those hunts are primarily held? They're both pretty big states, so it's when people think about Louisiana, I don't know if they're hunting bears in swamps in the bayou, or is it more upstate? Can you give us a breakdown of that?
Yeah, so in Louisiana, it's primarily in the northeastern region of the state where their strongest bear populations are. It was one bear management unit that was hunted last year, and I think they're expanding that with the proposal this year to one or maybe two other units, but it's all still in that same general location because that's their strongest foothold of bears right there along the Mississippi River. Um, and then in Florida, it's kind of spread out throughout the state. Like I said, there's 4 different units that are being proposed, all that are have their strongest strongholds of black bears. Also, so Panhandle, there's a central unit. There's one further
Mm.
south, so it's geographically it's pretty spread as opposed to Louisiana, which is primarily in the northeastern part of the state.
I mean, bears not knowing political boundaries and the other states that you Gulf states that you cover in Mississippi and Alabama, smack in between these 2 states that have black bear seasons. What's the situation in those states?
Yeah, so it's funny that you bring up Mississippi too, because in my part of the state, it's always been somebody said, "Oh, I saw a black bear the other day," and people were like, "Man, be quiet. You didn't see a black bear. There's no black bears up here, you know." And a news story broke actually earlier this week. There's a black bear running around in DeSoto County, which is just south of Memphis. I mean, you're talking, 15, 20 minutes from Memphis, Tennessee, large metropolitan area, and there's a black bear running around neighborhoods in Nesbitt, Mississippi, and people are freaking out, and there's news stories and like, "Oh, we're not supposed to have black bears in Mississippi." A lot of people don't realize that Mississippi is supposed to have black bears. I mean, you
Yeah,
always you hear about the Teddy Roosevelt hunts and all that. Black bears are a big part of um, the hunting heritage in the state, and much like Louisiana and Florida and some of the other southern states, they got to the point where they were nearly extinct down here, and thanks to the restoration efforts that these states have put into it, you're seeing a successful rebound. And back when I was at Mississippi State, now 5 or 6 years ago. It's hard to believe, but, they told us that, we're 10 years from seeing Mississippi have a black bear season. And again, so that was 5 or 6 years ago. So you're talking here in the next, I'd say, 4 to 8 years, that
mm.
proposal might be on the table. I'm not saying that it will be, obviously, but, with Louisiana experiencing population booms, we're starting to see somewhat of a population boom in Mississippi, and you're starting to see bears in places where they haven't been in decades. Might not be too far off. Um, and you want to talk about Florida and their proposal. Florida's one of 6 states that's got a resident black bear population, and uh, that aren't hunted. And you look at the estimated population statewide, they're looking at over 4,000 bears potentially. And that's far and away more than any of the other states on the table that have a resident bear population that aren't hunted. And you look at Louisiana and, they're sitting at, I think the top estimate for Louisiana is 1,500 bears. Well, and you're seeing a successful season. And money going back into conserving that resource and ensuring genetic diversity and what have you. So, yeah, it's one of those things where, the science certainly backs up the effort and one that, frankly needs to be brought back.
Yeah, so 2 overarching themes I think that are gonna be throughout this conversation between the 3 of us is the science is there, and we have to trust the science. We can't be selective in the science that we, the general public and air finger quote professionals in the space, can't cherry pick that for agendas, social agendas. And then 2, conflict. As these populations expand, as they grow in the way we want them to, not being managed in the right way, we have conflict, whether it's human and animal conflict or if it's predator on prey conflict with domesticated critters that, we're going to get into with Maria here. Um, we're trying to avoid that, understanding that hunters have a direct place in that as preferred management. It's cost effective. It's one of the tenets of the North American model. Like, plenty to back up why we play a critical role in this. And then to your point, Mark, those hunter dollars going back into to support healthy populations, diverse populations, and making sure, um, all the conservation work that's been done over a century plus is is funded. So, um, again, I don't want to be repetitive about it, but again, for the audience, I think you're going to see themes here, and we're going to explain why. Uh, Going over to the West and talking about what I just said, bears, cats, wolves. Um, you have states out there, Marie, that wolves are native. We know there's states that they've been reintroduced and have caused havoc. We've talked about Prop 127 to death on this program and what that sought to do. You've dealt with the same thing with hounds, banning hound hunting, um, banning hunting on these charismatic uh, cute, cuddly critters supposedly, and bears and cats, and people like to look at them as friendly, domesticated critters. Um, Threw a lot out there at you. Just tell your story, what you've been dealing with, and hit the audience to how this affects everybody across the country, not just locally to you.
Yeah. Thank you, Fred. The West is really the place to go if you want to dive into the conflicts around the more majestic predators, I guess, the ones everyone is flocks to and really gets passionate about. I guess just speaking to the conflict that you brought up, for example, in Washington State, we already have one pack that's qualified for potential lethal removal or for lethal removal consideration. In Washington State with wolves, if you have 3 wolf livestock depredations in 30 days or 4 in 10 months, then that pack qualifies for consideration. And we've just
Yeah.
got into spring grazing season. Ranchers are just starting to turn out cattle, and we already have one pack that's qualified.
Wow.
So, really, what we're looking at in the West right now is a social acceptance and social tolerance levels. Things are getting tough. But we had Washington State seemed like it was going in a good direction where we were starting to calm things down, and it's really kicking up again as the populations continue to rise and expand. Speaking on bear populations, Washington State right now is currently sitting at 26 to 30,000 black bears. And we're having debates on possibly scaling back some of those seasons. Luckily, the commission this year did vote to kind of keep things as close to the same as they've been in the past so that we can maintain our current management levels to keep those populations more sustainable. There's fears from some on the hunting side that we're going to reach a prey collapse point because we do have wolves, we have black bears, we have cougars, and now they're looking at reintroducing grizzlies. And some in northeastern Washington are coming over from Idaho, Montana, and Wyoming, where they have very thick populations.
Hmm.
And how that impacts the rest of the states is there's a lot of conversations right now on trapping. They're looking at there's been lawsuits around trapping and blocking some wolf trapping methods to protect grizzly bears. or they're looking at, bear trapping. There's a lot of different changes coming in trapping that's going to impact our predator and prey management in these states, but then those have further implications in other states. If you look at um, if lynx and bobcat, how will those trapping management decisions be impacted by these court decisions? So there's a lot going on. It's you could talk forever about that topic, especially when you get into
Yeah,
the
no doubt.
endangered species ones.
Yeah, I'm happy to go there. Maybe not at this point in the conversation, but I think it's worth bringing up. Um, you started going down the trapping hole, and I think it's important to bring up. Obviously, we look at our lower 48 in totality, and like culturally, socially, I feel like we have like a half a dozen countries within our lower 48 border. So tradition wise, hunting heritage differs in all those parts. Mark's area, very rich. The Southeast, very rich hunting tradition. Northeast, we do too, although in the same thing in the West, but socially becoming less acceptable. And we're seeing that, a talk with Mark Duda in kind of a big meta picture. The public perception and approval of hunting is on a 3-year decline. They're noticing that and they're sounding the alarm. Mark and his responsive management research company and the people that they partner with put this stuff out. So that's alarming in and of itself. And Mark, you may see some of this in these traditional strongholds in the Southwest and places in between. But trapping being one of those victims, I think everywhere that kind of transcends the cultural heritage, because just it's been so maligned. There's been so much propaganda um, from the anti-crowd put behind its demise that we're losing a very valuable tool that provides the state agencies pretty much with free free management for their meso predators. There's out where you're at, Marie, their larger predator species um, provides so much biological data, gives the state agency professionals a good look at habitat health, ecosystem health on the landscape, and doing it on the dime of the trapper. The audience has heard me talk about this before, so I don't want to bemoan the topic. But to your point about lynx and bobcat, but lynx exclusion areas, I think 2 years ago I was interviewing John Daniel at National Trappers Association, in very real time, he was getting phone calls about Idaho wolverines, affecting not just trapping, but hunting in totality, because in Idaho, Airfinger, quote, "threatened species," which they're not threatened, it's the lower, uh, threshold of their natural range, right? I mean, you go over the border to Canada, there's no problem with them. In Alaska, state you cover, you can trap them, no problem. They're well managed, but once they started coming down south, all of a sudden, there were these exclusion zones, and the way they were defining take and Murray, I think you and I talked about this in the past, was that even if you could see them, that was taking Wolverine. You were interfering. So not only was it a potential, and I don't know where they came down on this. I think it happened. Not only could you not hunt and trap in that area, but it started affecting other ecotourism as far as mountain bikers, ATV riders, things like that, and shutting whole areas down just because one or two critters was in there. So these these decisions that are being made, are having direct effects on the management, on the landscape of these species. And, I open it up to both of you on the conversation of what you guys deal with in your respective states and the agencies that you work alongside with. I don't care who goes first.
I think one of the biggest ones for us was the grizzly bear trapping decision that impacted wolf and a lot of trapping. Um, and still curious to see how that will turn out completely with some of the recent changes to the grizzly bear distinct population segment and how they redrew that map recently. Because previously from the lawsuit, there were sections of Idaho and I believe Montana as well, where you could not trap for wolves outside of grizzly bear denning season. So it changed the whole season for trappers in these areas using certain styles of traps. Now that that map has expanded, I'm curious to see how that decision will impact. and how long that will stand because it will be a long time before the Washington Northern Cascades population, they haven't even started reintroductions yet. So to get that recovered is going to now Washington State is impacting management in Idaho, Montana, and Wyoming. So it keeps stretching out and then it impacts hunting seasons and hunting styles.
Mark, how about you?
Yeah, from a trapping perspective in the Southeast, I mean, historically, the Southeast has been so pro trapping. And I still think you see that. You just don't see the number of trappers on the landscape that you used to see. And, there's a lot of factors that go into that. One being, fur prices aren't what they used to be. So it's not worth a lot of people's time to do it. Um, so you've seen a pretty steep decline in trapping down here. But I would say you are starting to see a little bit of a resurgence just from the turkey hunting community. There's been a lot of positive messaging that, state agencies as well as, NWTF, Turkeys for Tomorrow, and some of these other groups have put out about, the effects of trapping and eliminating a lot of those nest predators and impacts on turkey populations because that's such a hot topic down here and that, the turkey populations aren't what they have been and people need to do more. So you are starting to see a little bit of a resurgence in trapping. You, from a legislative front, from a regulatory front, yeah, there are times where you'll see some misguided, I guess you could say, efforts to limit, certain types of traps and those type things. But as far as just an outright opposition to it, you don't necessarily see that. And a lot of people don't understand that, trapping is so important for state agencies also. It's not just the people that are harvesting fur or, trying to manage for their turkeys or whatever. The state agencies are trapping to collect a lot of valuable biological data as well. And I think, there's some better messaging that's being put out that shows that.
There was a state in the Midwest, and you forgive me for not remembering, but they, whoever that state was, what I remember the details was, is with this resurgent of trapping, specifically raccoon, so we look at the Midwest and the South and, um, those critters being, one of the biggest perpetrators of nest raiding and destroying, recruitment of turkeys and other, land laying birds. They were offering to have an open season on raccoons just to wipe them out, and that was their methodology, and I was like, in predator management, we can't vilify one species over all the others that are contributing to this. So, I mean, skunks, possum, coyotes, bobcat, you just wanna put the target on one critter, and I don't that I think flies in the face of the North American model as well, and extrapolation of one species or landscape, what does that do? Because they do have a rightful place in the system.
And one of the things that Mark touched on that's impacting trapping participation, how with the market down, we see participation go down. We're seeing a legislative effort in the Northwestern states, and it's not a trapping ban per se, but it is a retail sale of furs ban. And a lot of the language on it is aimed around chemicals not being safe for the environment or it not being a humane resource. And unfortunately, I think a lot of legislators don't realize that that bill would, in effect, not ban trapping, but would greatly diminish it. And there is
Mhm,
specific language, kind of protecting trapping so long as the person who trapped the animal is selling it directly to the end user. So then it eliminates any of the fur trade markets.
mhm.
And that would have a negative downstream effect on some of that management that you said, Fred, is done for free by trappers. Like Delta Waterfowl's Million Duck Project, where they're really focusing on protecting nesting sites and utilizing trapping to help manage those nesting sites. A lot of that would be diminished just by the freeze in the market if bills like those passed.
Yeah, and then there's, others that we've dealt with here in the Northeast, similar to that, but also stopping the import, of these fur products. And initially you go to, fashion, things like that, furniture type stuff and accoutrement, but in talking with Jason Wisniewski, the president of FTA, a couple of years ago, brought to my attention that the angling community, and we've covered this in our Sportsman's Voice publication. Um, the fishing community being directly affected by the lack of fur in their lure making and fly tying. You think of world class trout fishing in the Virginias, out by Umery, that people just all over the world come to, and as well as the Southeast. What does that look like if you remove very common material used in some of these traditional methods? Thoughts, Mark?
No, no, nothing that you haven't already touched on. I mean, it's a domino effect. And a lot of people, especially legislators, a lot of times don't necessarily understand that. It's like somebody comes to them with an issue, and they're like, "Oh, well, we need to do something about that." Well, they don't take into effect what happens down the road, right? And that's where organizations like ours come in and say, "Hey, look, this is what's going to happen if you do X, Y, and Z." Uh, and I think we're doing a good job with that.
I think it's important for legislators to and even governors' offices as well in the states. Um, Often the loudest people in the room, in the emails, on the phone get the attention and they get serviced. We've acknowledged on our program that our community needs to step up and do better. But my message to those folks, the law signers and decision makers, is at least be able to think critically about it. Okay, this demographic of people is calling me up, blowing up my email or my message machine about about trapping or about beavers. And we can talk about, well, it's a predator show, but another topic for another time. Beaver management, um, and they take it for what these loud people are saying, and I want them to kind of try to look at it from the other perspective, like why are these animals being trapped? Why does the state agency do this in the first place, right? Terminology like management and North American model is not going to be commonplace to them. So trying to think about this in everyday common language, and that's how I'm hoping people can start looking at this stuff, not just responding to loud emotional arguments, and start asking the why. Um, and then they start getting answers. And then, administratively, these governors' offices should be talking to their state directors of these agencies. Okay, this bill's coming, or this constituency is losing their mind over bobcat trapping or wolf reintroduction or wolf trapping. Why are you guys doing this in the first place? What service does are you providing by allowing these seasons? I think that's a great place to start, because this stuff does get very wonky, and the 3 of us look at each other like, "How do people not get this?" But it's not common knowledge, and, the decision makers need to start asking those questions if they're not.
I think it's important for them to ask those questions, but it's also important for us to share our voice. And this is something I constantly harp
Right.
on, but the hunting community tends to be overly humble and we
Yeah.
don't speak up for
I would say that.
ourselves. And I think having quality people sharing quality messages is going to be very important going forward because we haven't told our story enough yet.
Another angle on this predator management that we see all over the country is the use of hounds for selective take. Um, Out by Umery, a lot of that, the terminology around it is harassment. I don't necessarily from a marketing standpoint like that terminology, but, deterrence, we'll call it, or, just, de-incentivizing large predators to be around livestock or schools, common places where people gather. Um, and it often gets maligned as well with propaganda, and the use of hounds is just so important, almost like bait, in that you get to assess these animals. In some states, I think Idaho is a good example. Like there's certain areas, like for with mountain lion hunting, you're only allowed to take a mountain lion in certain areas. So you need to be able to identify that and not just shooting to shoot and fill a tag. Um, there's reasons why those quotas are there, why they're looking to take certain sex of animals, and hounds especially allow the hunters to make those decisions alongside a guide, or if they're knowledgeable enough to handle that on their own. So, when the anti-crowd is like, "Wow, they're pestering these animals, they're harassing them, they're bullying them," At the very worst, these animals are inconvenienced for a little bit, and the selective nature of it, I think, is a big, uh, pro on our side that we can stand on and be like, "Listen, we're not just out there, stacking bodies." Like, we're very prescriptive and purposeful about what we are doing out.
Was at a wolf advisory group meeting recently, and they had a better name for harassment. They called it spank and release
Spank and
as
release.
a non-lethal deterrent for wolves that are getting too close or depredating on livestock, and they've actually have studies showing the effectiveness of that. One of the problems we're seeing in the Northwest in our states where hounds and baiting are banned is we are starting to take more females than are desired. For example, in Washington state, they do look at our population. You have to have them sealed and checked, and they're managing by what percentage of females are taken each year. And it's a lot easier to control the numbers a female take when you are allowing selective tools to be utilized in the field. Unfortunately, we don't have those available to us any longer.
What does that look like as far as getting them back? How was that settled, when those got worked
It
out?
varies state by state. Washington State, for example, it was a ballot initiative. So it's one that's going to be very difficult to overturn because legislators aren't always willing to go against the will of the voters. So that would be a difficult
Mhm.
one to overturn and hard to explain in a state like Washington.
Mark, talk about, what that looks like for Louisiana and potentially Florida, those considerations, on bears.
Yeah, so in Louisiana, there's no hunting with hounds, but you can bait in Louisiana, and the reasoning behind it is to allow those hunters that were successful in drawing a tag to be more selective in the bears that they harvest. So, like I said, there were 11 tags that were issued. 10 tags were filled. Of those 10 tags, there were only two females that were killed, and both of those females were old and non-lactating females. And the way that they set the season structure there, you know, middle of December, towards the end of December, um, they set that because most of the females that did have cubs were denning at that time. So, taking that step to allow their hunters to be more selective, and they also did, the bear identification, the bear hunting classes before the season started, because like I said, Louisiana hasn't had a bear hunting season since the 1980s. So nobody really knew how to judge a bear, how to, what bear do I need to take? And the agency did a great job at teaching that. And then you look at Florida, and Florida's interesting because the initial framework that was approved last month, uh, baiting is included and the use of hounds is included. And the reasoning that they gave is because they want hunters in Florida to be more selective. Because the outcry from the anti hunting community back in 2015, when they did a quota where, the season was a week long and they exceeded that quota within, 2 days, which, my opinion, that means you had a lot more bears on the landscape than dogs
That's
did.
right.
But, they had check stations. 'Cause back then you couldn't electronically report harvest. And, the anti-community camped out at these check stations and people were bringing in, what people considered cubs, which were bears under 75 pounds. And, some lactating females were killed. And, that gives them more ammunition to say, look, these people are orphaning cubs. They're killing lactating females. And that ultimately is what resulted in there not being a black bear hunting season in Florida for 10 years and maybe more if we're not successful in August. But, um, that the agency took that feedback. And when they came back with this initial proposal, they included, hey, you want our hunters to be more selective. Here's how they can be more selective. Uh, so all good things, and hopefully we'll see it come to fruition in August.
Mark, we talk about the big predators out west and bears here in the Northeast, but Florida, interestingly enough, I think most of this crowd knows you guys have a population of cats. What are they called down there? Panthers.
Florida Panthers.
So cougar, catamount, mountain lion, all the same critter. It's a big cat that can do some damage. How are those managed in Florida, if you know? And I ask this because so much social media In the last few years, especially during turkey season, you're seeing hunters have interactions with them. Typically, it's always like cool videos of bobcats coming in on decoys. Um, but panthers are showing up in turkey spreads, and bears too. But most of the social media around it has been on cats. And what's that look like?
Yeah, so the Florida panther, that's an entirely different discussion than the black bears in Florida.
Mhm.
Um, I can't speak to the exact science and what the population estimates and all that are like, and I can tell you there's not a hunting season that's on the table for Florida panthers in any way, to
Mhm.
my knowledge at this point. But you are seeing more and more reports and videos, like you said, Fred, of especially turkey hunters out there, and they're calling up the gigantic house cats, you know?
Yeah, crazy.
But you're seeing in Florida, Florida is developing at a rate that it's crazy. You know, the amount of urban and suburban development, and you're seeing these booms in black bear populations, and these panther populations, and you're gonna see more conflict. You're gonna see more and more human wildlife conflict. And on the bear side of things, it's like, you know, when it comes to human wildlife conflict, in the end, the animal is gonna lose. I mean, governments, commissions, you know, uh, people are gonna win that argument in the end. And what can these state fish and wildlife agencies do to mitigate that concern or that problem? And hunting is, as we all know, and as our listeners I'm sure know that it's one of the most valuable tools out there to help mitigate that problem, most cost efficient and effective. So yeah, so when it comes to the Florida Panthers, I can't expand too much on that other than, they put it to the Oilers pretty good last night. But uh,
Yeah, they did. Um, it's just an interesting wrinkle in all this because some of these other animals get the, pun intended, the lion's share of the limelight here and the attention, but they exist, and then to that point, we're supposed to have Barry Snell on here who manages Southeast, but you are starting to see jaguars crossing international borders into states like Arizona, where they have not been seen in many decades, and all of a sudden with consistent regularity that they are creating a being a presence. And much like we talked about earlier, Marie, about the Wolverine or the abuse that is played upon the ESA with lower 48 populations of grizzlies. What is that going to look like if they do establish a foothold in Arizona? Um, and what does that do to hunting down there? And all of a sudden, now the state agency has to manage and make special considerations for these animals. And I'm going here, this line of thought here with some reintroduction things I want to talk about. But I just like to get you guys' thoughts on jaguars and I think ocelots too. I mean, holy smokes. You got all these jungle cats that are starting to come over.
One thing I think on those, it's a neat opportunity if they're starting studies now to see predator prey interactions as a new predator and comes onto the landscape while there's already existing predators, but also on predator and predator interactions and how those change. I
Mm.
really wish as wolves had moved west and across, from Wyoming and Montana out of Yellowstone and into the surrounding states, I really wish we had studied those impacts because now it becomes a battle of um, anecdotal evidence, what hunters are seeing on the landscape, what environmentalists think is happening on the landscape. It We're battling over it. I'd love to see in the South. We know these are coming. We've seen what can happen from wolves and that spread. I really hope that that's being studied just so we can get a measure of how that's going to impact the prey species and hunting in general and hunting availability.
Thoughts, Mark? I think your area's also seen some wild critters coming and you used to have Texas, and maybe it's more Texas that was seeing that. I think there's rumors of black panthers in Louisiana, but I think that's all just tall tales of locals.
yeah, everybody sees a black panther every now and then, especially in my part of the world. And I mean, it's kind of like Bigfoot. It's like enough people see them. Are they really out there? But yeah, even going back to Florida too, a good example of this are the pythons down there. and their impact on the Everglades in southern Florida and how they've almost completely wiped out native mammal populations, especially small mammals, possums, raccoons, those type things, and even deer in some cases. So yeah, it's certainly an interesting topic.
That's an interesting wrinkle, Mark, because my geographical bias, we don't have large reptiles. Don't even have venomous. And thinking of your area, not only do you have these invasive, snakes, but you guys have alligators to deal with in every single one of your states, in the region that you cover. Also a predator, prey and on the landscape relationship that has to be managed. Can you speak to any alligator? I think the social aspect of that, people, look at them and they're not so cute and cuddly, so I think they probably have a better reaction to mitigating, human conflict there, because pretty much I think you're gonna die most of the time with that interaction, but what's management look like for that predators?
Yeah, so alligators aren't cute and cuddly and furry like so many other predator species. So the pushback uh, on hunting alligators is pretty much non-existent down here.
Mhm.
Mississippi has expanded opportunities in recent years. I think the draw application period in Mississippi actually closes tomorrow for public waters. It's something that I've always wanted to do because it's a relatively new opportunity. Like I said, it was one that popped back up just a handful of years ago, and it provides an additional way to get outside. Outside of normal or traditional hunting seasons. And it's interesting because, I mean, a lot of people can't say that they've ever hunted or killed an alligator. So,
Right, right.
and then obviously it's a huge business, both recreationally and commercially in Louisiana. That's one of the greatest conservation success stories, probably in the country, is the rebound of the alligator in Louisiana and,
Yeah, yeah.
the cultural and economic importance that species has down there. And, taking it back to, some of these initiatives to limit fur use for different things. We saw that in California when they tried to ban alligator and crocodilian skin, and which would have been a huge hit to the economy in Louisiana. And the NASC Executive Council and Louisiana Legislative Sports Caucus leadership played a big part in fighting that off. So, yeah, to your point, there's a lot of different interesting caveats when it comes to program management down here that, are all interesting.
Yeah, the alligator one, the alligator leather, I mean, again, if you're not directly involved and living in it, you don't even think about it, but I can sit here and think about how many products that have alligator, leather in them, from boots to handbags to cases to, decorative furniture, and there's a great value in the use of that resource. Never mind the flesh that is so delicious. If you've never had alligator, it is very good. So a lot of that animal gets utilized, which is fantastic. And there's, like you said, there's just so much, um, uh, business to be done around that contributes, greatly to local economies. And those bands from these more, I don't know, they would call themselves socially conscious or socially aware folks on the coast. They do a great disservice. And again, it's all based on management. And I come back to the reptilian species. I think it's a great example of the bias that is put on the um, the attractive furry critters versus an ugly, scaly critter that no one has a problem killing. It's just, again, there's no science behind it. It's just, how people perceive something that's aesthetically pleasing versus something that, looks like it's likely going to kill you if you have an interaction with it, which is odd because you would think bears and big lions, would also kill you, but people for some reason think that they're immune from that.
Yeah, and it's so interesting, and I'm sure Marie can talk to this too, but the public perception of different predator species. And, it's easy to look at, how people feel about alligators versus a black bear or what have you, but even just the geographical differences. And like when Louisiana was proposing bringing back their black bear season, the commission meetings that I attended, you had, maybe a dozen people that were there, and, only a handful of those people spoke, for that specific agenda item, and most of them obviously were speaking in support of it. And then you had, some groups that were there that spoke out against it. But you look at that, and then you look at Florida and the meeting last month, you had 170 people registered to speak on that specific agenda topic. And the breakdown was, the hunters had a really good showing in Florida. I was actually impressed to see the number of folks that were there to speak in support, because we were expecting such an outpouring of opposition from the anti-hunting uh, world, and we certainly saw that. And we of the 170, probably I'd say a little more than half, probably 60% of the folks that were there spoke in opposition to it, and spoke very passionately about why they were opposed to it. And we didn't see that in Louisiana uh, over something that it's the proposals were a bit different, but in the end, it's a black bear season. People are going to go and kill black bears. So the public perception, just the difference between those 2 states, and
Mm.
Florida's a different beast because it's just a mosh pit of different, people that have moved from all over the country to Florida.
Well, that's exactly right. You get a lot of people from my neck of the woods that, we call them snowbirds that have a second home down there, and then some have just relocated there permanently and bring their bad ideas with them. They don't assimilate at all. I would say the same thing for the desert Southwest, that you have weather that's extremely accommodating to people that have, suffered gross winters their whole life and dealt with aches and pains, and they find, relief in these places. And again, there's no assimilation. They just bring their bad thoughts or things that they ran away from with them, and that, policy wise can have a terrible impact on traditional means and, methodology of management. I wanna go back to the pin that I stuck in here. I was talking to, Marie specifically about reintroduction, and again, market obviously the bear reintroduction in the South, but, wolves, grizzly bears in the Northwest, and then most recently, when I was at the, NEAFWA conference, there was an individual that got up very enthusiastically and made a presentation on the potential of reintroducing mountain lions to the Northeast, and started going on this tear, showing maps, showing areas that have already been identified to have good habitat, good contiguous acres of habitat. And I'm looking at the map and I'm like, well, there's a concentration human center. Here's one over here. But you're telling me that the woods in between will provide, and these cats aren't gonna, escape these woodland lots in the Adirondacks, the Green Mountains of Vermont, the Great North Woods of Maine. And then I saw another article is I think it was recently earlier this week talking about the same thing in Vermont, reintroducing, and what a great idea this is. Ladies and gentlemen, this is a terrible idea as illustrated in Colorado with wolves. That will definitely be illustrated in Washington with the reintroduction of a mega predatory species and grizzly bear. They're not here anymore, and that's whether it was, by some hunting or because the landscape didn't allow. They are not here naturally anymore. Furthermore, that lady that was speaking, she showed a timeline progression of what they estimate um, mountain lions to naturally move east and north. And she said, I think it was like a 75-year trajectory that it would take those populations to migrate somewhere else, and they wanna fast forward it in 10 years, and it's like, it's not natural, and you're gonna see a lot of problems of it. Some of those I already espoused on is now the agency has to deal with these animals. What do they do with these areas that they're in? What is the cost to the agency to manage them? Public education, the instance of human predator interaction, these are all terrible ideas, and even Mark, I didn't get to bring it up, but your hearings on the black bear in Florida were well timed, for a terrible reason. There was an 80-something-year-old man that was killed, and his dog was literally eaten by a black bear just a week or so before you guys had that conversation down there. So, this I don't know if it's a rewilding, philosophy or how you wanna label it, but this idea of putting mega predators back on the landscape in areas they don't have is just I don't wanna be, like, hyperbolic, but it could be terrifying and not cost effective to, local economies that especially depend on ecotourism, and that is not consumptive. I get both of your thoughts. I'll start with Marie on that.
Yeah, one of the problems, so Washington State, where they're looking at bringing grizzly bears in the North Cascades, wolves are currently starting to make their way there naturally out of Northeast Washington, heading into that central north area of Washington. And you start putting grizzlies in there. It goes back to those questions I have. What do we do when we artificially put predators in there too quickly? What happens to the prey? What's going to happen conflict wise if the prey have trouble? That area is developing right now, and the mule deer, which depend on corridors for traveling for their winter migration, are already having a hard time with the increased development, new roads. Wolves are coming in, and now we're going to add grizzly bears. Like, at what point have we done too much to the area? Same with Colorado. By ballot initiative, they had to introduce wolves. And when you're translocating and reintroducing, one of the things that I think a lot of people overlook is those animals can die as well. Like, they've lost
Mm,
several of those wolves. Sometimes it's to human conflict, sometimes it's just to conflict with other predators, or they're just not able to establish well. In Colorado, they've had depredation issues, and it's impacting the elk population in the area where they've been released. I think sometimes we look at and we get excited about we have this habitat that's perfect for this predator and we want to get this predator in that habitat, but we aren't looking at the big picture. What does that do to the prey species in the area, the people in the area? And can that habitat truly sustain them with all the development going on? I think sometimes we get too much tunnel vision when we're talking about reintroduction.
mhm. Mark, your thoughts?
I mean, not a whole lot more to add than what Marie just laid out too, but I mean, everybody thinks it's a great idea until they look out in their backyard and they see a bear or a mountain lion that's pestering their dog or their cat, or their dog or their cat ends up missing, and people were like, "Oh, well, now we need to do something about this." Well, at that point, it's too late.
Doesn't that transcend so many social issues I could come up with? And it's a lot of these people championing these kind of issues, and they're like, "Yeah, this is great." And then in parentheses, "as long as it's not my backyard." So many of these things, you look at the news here the last, I don't know, 72 hours. There's a lot of stuff going on, in our country right now that is extremely controversial, and people are advocating one way or the other, and it's often people that none of this stuff is happening in their area, and their ecosystem, and they're all good to levy an opinion as long as it's not directly affecting them, right?
Yeah, and another good point on that too, that I'd like to highlight from the last FWC commission meeting is, the local sheriff, in the county in which the commission meeting was being held, attended and spoke in support of the black bear season, just because he spoke on the amount of calls that his department receives
Yeah.
of people that are scared because there's a black bear in their backyard. And it at times is overwhelming dispatchers, and they're having to figure out, well, what do we need to do? We
Mm,
got to call FWC. We have to do this. We have to do that. And there comes a breaking point, right, where people are gonna have to do something about it. And again,
well, you go ahead, sorry, I didn't mean to
no, no,
step
no,
on you.
that's fine. I was just gonna say, and again, that ties back to utilize every tool in the tool belt, and hunting is a hammer. You know what I mean? I mean, it's important and it's effective.
Well, the areas of the country that aren't used to having these critters, like, if a black bear walked in my backyard right now, I'd be like, "Oh, cool, black bear, no big deal." And they do. Like, it's very commonplace, not a big deal. Um, but to your point, like, that sheriff is having to field those calls. What are they not responding to, right? So they're dealing with, whatever the critter is that people aren't used to. Um, what person is having a heart attack or what car accident, via DUI is not being responded to because they had to prioritize some scary critter in their backyard, right? And, again, I think of more so like lions and wolves and stuff like that, but
Yeah, I think the vast majority of people that live in suburban neighborhoods, they don't realize that these predators are going to stay in the deep woods. We'll never have to worry about them, but there comes a point where there's only so much space that those animals can utilize, and eventually they're gonna get pushed out. Well, where are they
Yep.
gonna go? Especially in a state like Florida where it's being developed at such a high rate. They're gonna end up in your backyard unless you manage that population.
And especially where we do such a good job of providing, food, water, and shelter, and opportunity for these animals, and most people don't even realize it by way of bird feeders, which I'm not against, I love my bird feeders, unsecure trash, um, fill in the blank. There's just so much opportunity for them, and animals, by design, are gonna go for the least, caloric expenditure they can possibly have. They're going for the easy grab. And you look at small predators. You look at New York City has a healthy population of eastern coyotes, in Central Park. That there's plenty of food there between human discard and squirrels living in there and mice and all that. Like, these animals are setting up shop, and there's no reason for them not to. Little small backyard livestock operations by way of, goats, pigs, and fowl, ducks and chickens, right? Like, this homesteading, or this idea of being self-sufficient, is great until you have to do homesteading stuff and deal with that stuff, right? Anyway, I digress. It's definitely a part of that conversation, and the detail-oriented considerations that we need to have with introduced predator species as well as the existing predator species, which segues into my last point I want to bring up with you guys is, the non-management of species in some states. For example, and I haven't really talked about the Northeast a lot, but here in New Hampshire, we have a robust population of bobcats, and the bobcats up here are far different from the bobcats in the South and the Southwest. That, size wise and look wise, but more so the size wise and what they predate on. Bobcats up here, come wintertime, when the deer yard up, they will predate on full-grown white-tailed deer. Right now, where they're dropping fawns, for sure, those are getting picked off by bobcat. They killed the bobcat season in the late '80s here in New Hampshire, and it's become a political football ever since. The University of New Hampshire has been funded to, to have 5-year studies that do a lot of camera traps and, all this, and they showed, there was more than enough to take on a very conservative season. I think Ollie days, almost 10 years ago now, where 50 cats were gonna be allowed to be taken between hunting and trapping combination. Antis got the 80% spun up, like, "Ha, I can't believe you would take bobcats. What's wrong with them?" And now, seemingly every other day, the local news station, and definitely, the little local community Facebook pages, there's always a bobcat on there. Like, you never saw that before, by design, right? And, bobcats aren't meant to be seen. But you have this healthy population, and getting back to trusting the science, and our legislators will not, have not addressed that because of the social backlash on that, even though it's to the detriment of the ecosystem, where bobcats are in competition with the coyotes, the local population of red fox and gray fox. They're they're killing our fisher. Like, they are direct competition, and the bobcat can take out a fisher, and they are affecting the fisher population here, which, it's terrible. So, throughout the country, I don't know, do you guys have any species of preference that are not managed like that?
We have some, and then you even get into the war of the endangered species. For example, we have sharp-tail and sage grouse are really struggling. Well, the ferruginous hawk is their biggest
Mm,
predator, and what do you do when two endangered species are in conflict? You see it on the Columbia River with endangered salmon species, with a recovered but still listed population of seals and sea lions and pinnipeds that are consuming the majority of those sea lions and salmon, and blocking them from getting out
right.
into the ocean, where the southern resident killer whale is being impacted by a lack of food source because they primarily feed on the river salmon that comes out into the ocean to spawn or breed. So, what do you do not just when you have the protected species that you can't hunt that are starting to impact the ecosystem, but when those protected species start having conflict with other protected species? And then you get into some very complicated management questions.
Mark, you have any of that in your area?
Outside black bear, Marie's got the better examples there, but
Yeah.
it's one of those points too where ideally you don't want legislators legislating regulation too. You want that state management authority really to reside with your professionals with the State Fish and Wildlife Agency and its commission, um, to make those decisions. And that's just a point that needs to be hammered home, as many times as we can.
Marie, you got my gears turning, especially talking about seals and I didn't even think about it for this conversation, but oceanic predator species. I think about the problem here on the East Coast that there's overpopulations that directly affect the commercial and recreational fisheries. The conflict that is between seals and humans, fishermen, the conflict that they are creating by attracting more white sharks in southern New England, especially. And then there's more and more seals. You get around Cape Cod and going north, but um, the Marine Mammalian or Mammal Protection Act of 1972 established this, and we have a hands-off approach to these critters, and, I think this is folly. I think this is something at the federal level we need to relook at, and most people are not gonna respond well to someone being like, "We need to hunt seals, we need to utilize seals." They it's a social landmine, but if you go over the border to Canada and go up to Alaska for native people, they utilize it just fine. I don't see a problem here, obviously, because I understand how this works. We understand how this works, but something like that is another great example of hands-off management. No one's touching them, and look at the conflicts that are created.
We had kind of a fun story, I guess, with the sea lion and seal predation. We were prepared to talk about Columbia River does have an exception. So Washington Department of Fish and Game does have some management. It's very tight, it's very limited, but they do have some management options. And we were preparing to talk about that during one of our legislative fishing events. One of our legislators had a salmon on his hook and it was taken and bit in half by one of the pinnipeds. So it was great kind of transition into our conversation and how those are impacting the overall population of salmon. So it was nice to have it demonstrated while we were preparing to talk about it.
What an interesting cross section of 2 different sides of the house, right? Because often Chris Horton comes on the show, and we talk about the Shark Act, and putting together that council to look at how to mitigate, shark depredation on the recreational fisheries, especially, in the Southeast, the South Atlantic. Um, Fishermen pulling their catch up, and all of a sudden it's half a fish or just a head, like, that's a problem. And how do we interact and live with these predator species in the ocean, and not go out there and just kill everything because that's not a solution either. I would imagine this is markedly more, difficult in the vast ocean. At least terrestrially, we have a good understanding or population index that we can lean on, but, yeah, man, I love this conversation. It's extremely controversial, which I'm never afraid to wade into those waters, but it's a conversation that needs to be had more often than it does. And I think we collectively, our organization, all of our talent, do a really fine job of wading into these waters and advocating and educating our legislators. We just need more of them to find shows like this or conversations like this, not always in, testimony form, because it's hard to, constantly be in those halls and just have these conversations when there's so much going on. Alright, what can we sign off here with, guys, around this conversation or otherwise that you are wrapping up your sessions with? Marie, go ahead.
I think a big part for the West is just overcoming misunderstandings or misinformation. There, there's a certain tilt on things in the West and a certain tone and tenor that doesn't match what we're experiencing in the field, and it's just a matter of getting out there, sharing that story, sharing that science with legislators so that they're able to see that full picture and make educated decisions instead of just going with the information that they've been handed. And we need to make sure that we're also sharing all of our information and sharing our stories.
Mark?
Yeah, just to compound on that, just follow the science. Don't listen to the emotionally driven arguments. Have confidence in your state fish and wildlife agency's professionals, the biologists that are providing you with that data, because that's what they do. So follow the science, make informed decisions, and from our community's perspective, providing a unified voice that supports that science to make educated decisions.
Here in the Northeast, it's traditionally centered around hounds and bears, which we haven't seen in a little while. A lot of legislation comes up about predator, uh, air finger quote contests, especially as it relates to coyotes. We've seen those bills defeated here in 2 sessions in a row, understanding that there's not 1,000 guys and gals out there participating in, again, contests. Like, it may be a handful at most, and they still have to follow the same prescription, the same seasons and bag limits that the agency puts forward. So it's not like they're doing a disservice to the resource or the population. So, um, I think one thing I would leave with this, and a lot of this happens in the West, but this idea of ballot box biology that we have hammered home with Prop 127 last year and some of the extra things that came with that. But in the other states where this stuff gets put to a vote, bad idea with the wolf reintroduction, things like that. We have that here specifically in Maine, and that has become a priority issue for us at CSF. In the 20 odd some odd states, I wanna say it's 24, but I could be a little off, 26 maybe, states where there are ballot initiative, options that we raise the threshold where it's not already high enough. So in these states where it's a simple majority of 50 plus 1, we very much wanna see legislation get passed that updates state constitutions specifically for wildlife management, that the threshold is raised to a 2/3 so that we're purposely and meticulously making these decisions, because it warrants that. It just can't be a simple, 50 plus 1. That's where we're at, and we are definitely working on that across the entire country. And I Maine, it will be introduced in the next session. This session's been a little crazy up there in Augusta, but I think we'll work things out and look forward to bringing that in 2026. Guys, I really appreciate the conversation, and joining us here today. And I would say if you have questions, especially if you're a legislator, go on to congressionalsportsman.org. We have issue briefs on this stuff as well as staff contact. If you're dealing with policy that's come across your desk or that you're getting ready to vote on, if you've not already, your session's not already closed, we can be a great resource for you if we're not already working with you. Um, you can find contact information. We'd be more than happy to have a conversation with you. Gonna put a bow on it. Thanks again to Marie, to Mark for joining us. I'm sorry Barry couldn't. Um, but we'll look forward to having you guys on again very soon. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thanks, Fred. Look forward to it.
All right. Thanks, guys. All right. My thanks to Mark and Marie. Fun conversation, as I said. I mean, I find it fun because I think it's important. I'm really passionate about it. I appreciate the species. You want to see them be healthy, but you also want to see that balance. I've always been, since I was a kid, enamored with the opportunity to engage with predator species, to hunt predator species. I don't know if it's this idea that it can hunt you just as well as you can hunt it, and it largely knows the landscape much better than you. But whatever it is, it's always been appealing to me. A great adventure, and it has a place. More importantly, it is part of conservation. It is part of balancing the landscape, biodiversity, and carrying capacity. Towards the end of the conversation there, and we're talking about the New Hampshire bobcat. You guys that tune in, this isn't new information to you, um, but it's a story worth retelling because you have this species that should be managed and is not, and now is causing problems in the ecosystem. Um, and even there at the very end, referencing the Marine Mammal Act of 1972 and the protections it puts on species like seals that are becoming a problem, or not becoming, that are a problem for the reasons I talked about there. You talk about an even more uncomfortable conversation. Never mind trying to talk about wolves and grizzly bears and lions. Um, and other small cats. Try having a conversation with your neighbor about wanting to utilize a great resource in many of our seal species, and uh, the fact that they taste good and you can utilize their fur and their hide, and yeah, conversation I'm always willing to have, but we have to be willing to come to the table and have these conversations and trust the science, as both Marie and Mark reiterated there. With that, going to end the show. Thanks as always for tuning in. Don't forget about our weekly roundup, bringing you news of the week every Wednesday, and then this particular program every other Thursday. Coming up, we have our quarter 2 federal policy update. We have a fun ladies hunt show we're going to talk about. And then just so much more coming down the line for our feature episodes. So don't forget to tune in, follow, like, subscribe, all that. Don't miss a show. And your participation helps this show get discovered. So thanks as always for tuning in. And we will see you next time. As always, CSF is your inside connection to outdoor legislation. We'll see you next time. So long. Thanks for joining us on this edition of the Sportsman's Voice podcast. Ladies and gentlemen, your support is crucial, and you can help us out right now by leaving a review, filling in those 5 stars where available, sharing this episode with friends and family, and engaging with us socially. CSF can be found on Facebook, Instagram, and X, formerly known as Twitter. Together, we can protect the outdoor sports we love and continue to keep you informed wherever you are. That's it for this week. Until next time, we'll see you later.